The Grey House by John Metcalfe. One. It was a small house, and in front of it, two twisted, sooty trees seemed to bicker venomously. Round it, drab streets anastomosed, and shriveled old sinners in shabby coats played wintry tunes on fiddles. At least this was the kind of setting Hammond gave the house. Looking out on southeastern London from One Tree Hill, he knew of course that it was lost in the general wilderness of grey. Yet still he felt it there, that subtle hidden presence, a single stipple in that dim half-tone, a single note in the dreamy, multitudinous chorus of the city. To Hammond, thus reviewing London very fixedly from the heights of Crofton, the house seemed peculiarly insistent. His eyes would roam over the great stretch of sombre masonry, from Nunhead and Brockley, just below him out across Denmark Hill and the waste of Camberwell, to that distant greyness where the river curled. And sometimes his gaze would halt, and he would wonder if he saw the house. Very patiently he would try to remember it, the house of the two trees and the mouldy stone vases on the lawn. It was then 2 weeks from the November evening on which, leaving Sir Winthrop Winton's in Queen Anne Street, he had been whirled away most astoundingly in a taxi at breakneck speed round Chandos Street and Cavendish Square, down Princes Street, out onto Oxford Street, and along Charing Cross Road, and so by the Strand and Waterloo Bridge, into the desert of southern London. That was in the evening. The quick slide of yellow lights past the windows was suddenly hidden by dark coverings that dropped like hasty blinds on the outside. Mr. Hammond, astonished but gripping his amazement very firmly, made quick note of the fact that at the moment when the windows were covered, they were just turning out of Chandos Street and into Cavendish Square. Some little time later, the sudden change to the rough jump on macadam from the colourless dry glide across an asphalt surface told him they were crossing to the Surrey side. Hammond, deprecatory as always of the abnormal, felt his pulse and noted the beat of his heart. His head was aching, and a suspicion that he was being suffocated made him go to the communication tube and smell at it. The faint odour of dirty metal and perished rubber was reassuring and eminently sane. It was useless to halloa up the tube at any rate as yet. In what appeared to be a case of kidnapping, he decided that he had better try all other expedients before those of bribery and threat. For the next 5 minutes, Hammond and the darkness about him, heavy with the smell of damp leather, were cutting across midnight London at 30 miles an hour. He was sensible of this darkness enveloping him as of a real entity, almost a companion. He could assess its personality, as he could that of a human being, and above the two, conducting them as it appeared with a kind of resolute suavity, sat the driver. After 10 minutes, the form of this driver became almost clear to Hammond. He was, by looking back over what seemed a long time, able to remember this tall black figure in a wrinkled mackintosh. Hammond had hailed him as the car was passing slowly, just outside Sir Winthrop's, and, having climbed inside and closed the door, had called out his destination with his usual dry distinctness. 19 Calthrop Gardens. The figure had seemed to nod assent. Hammond had fallen back among the cushions of the car, and then suddenly he had been whirled off into amazement, and the falling shutters had plunged him in utter darkness. He felt for matches, found two, the last in the box, and lit one. The momentary gleam was not instructive. The interior of the taxi was entirely ordinary, and the reflection of his face in one of the windows, cold and black against the screen outside, was eerie and disquieting. The match died out, and he struck the other. With it, he lit a cigar, and, puffing, thought things out. He found, as they continued their remarkable journey, a peculiar contentment stealing over him, and a great disinclination to alter his position. He had, of course, tried the doors, and found them locked, and was now surprised to discover himself quite relieved by the fact. Somehow, in this closed cube of blackness, cigar in mouth, steeped in a peculiar languor, he seemed to be slipping fast away from the life he knew, the quite interesting but rather monotonous existence of an elderly dabbler in philosophy, into something rare and strong and pleasantly familiar. The taxi rocked. They were going at breakneck speed, and outside, he felt, string upon string of houses was fleeting by them into blackness. Within, meanwhile, Mr. Hammond, sucking his cigar and pondering wisely, was being borne thus wonderfully into the great unknown. The most remarkable point about the whole thing, as it appeared to Hammond, musing upon One Tree Hill, was that he could remember nothing of what happened between his journey in the taxi and his discovery of himself on what seemed to be the early morning of next day, standing up, still within the car, and looking at a small grey house. He seemed to be drawing his breath in something of that regretful feeling of finality that comes at the end of an enthralling play. Passively, almost, he had seen the blinds fall again, and had felt himself borne once more over what appeared a considerable distance. During that time, to complete the preposterous fantasy of the whole adventure, he recorded his impressions in a notebook, regardless of darkness and vibration, on being set down near the corner of Forest Hill Road, at which point the door seemed to swing open spontaneously. He rushed round to the front of the taxi to see the driver, but the vehicle started too quickly for him and vanished almost immediately. A dark form alone was visible for an instant, and the queer shrouds over the windows streamed flapping in the air like sombre scarves. Two. One Tree Hill was a place adapted to meditation of the distressful kind. On clear days, one could look for miles away onto the northern heights, across all the sounding gulf that lay between, and even when the fog hung heavy in the valley, one was still able to consider the bister affliction of sad sister hills, looming dimly through the murk. Again and again would Mr. Hammond take his seat here beside a little tree, and wonder over his adventure as his gaze wandered over the tumbled sea of London. Somewhere in the distance, under the shrouding mist, the house stood, sitting up there and looking out to the dim northeast. He seemed to feel it returning his regard, like a hiding, watchful thing. A mile away it might be, or 2 or 3, he knew not where. Yet very surely, as his glance swept over the limitless drab expanse, he felt that out there, buried and covered in the midst of all that baffling entanglement of winding streets, the windows of the house looked out like the eyes of an ambushed creature. The whole adventure seemed to him so unreal and fantastic that he had not mentioned it to a living soul. One is perhaps to understand that 50 years of spiritual desiccation had rendered noble intimacy almost impossible to Mr. Hammond. Nobody could have imagined that really fervid and immoderate things did sometimes occur within his mind, and so his purple moments, when they were achieved, were entirely private and unsuspected. It is a weakness of such natures to keep diaries, often displaying a lamentable introspective power, and Mr. Hammond's journals were doubtless of this description. The notes that he had made in the taxi drive to One Tree Hill he carefully revised and rearranged. He became more and more conscious that he had undergone a unique and probably valuable mystical adventure. In particular, the blank in his remembrance of what had happened on that astonishing night was altogether inexplicable. It grew steadily clearer that whatever might have occurred in the grey house was something out of line with ordinary fact, something parallel to it, perhaps, but neither one with it nor contrary to it. Kind of vacuum in experience, as he phrased it to himself. How, he asked, could he justify or refute this astounding conviction? How, if the house really existed, could he work his way back to it, step by step through all the mazy turns by which it had been left? His first scheme smacked of the rather obvious and uninspired methods of the detective. The notes that he had made had been written in a violently jolting car. So much appeared quite plain and matter-of-fact. Could he, thought Hammond, by noticing the way in which his pencil had scrawled out at certain points, deduce the direction of the turns that the car had made as the notes were being written? Slight reflection showed that this plan was utterly impracticable, and he thought out others, equally or still more futile. As the impossibility of discovering the house became ever more apparent, the strange fascination that it held for him increased, and with it the conviction that he had stumbled into an experience of the highest mystical significance. It was nearly 3 weeks after his adventure that Hammond's idea came to him. He had been whirled away to the grey house on the night of the 7th, and this was the 26th. He was standing in his little plot of lawn in Calthrop Gardens, looking at the last yellow leaves fluttering from the trees, when suddenly the thought occurred to him, why not try to work backwards to the house from One Tree Hill? Why not set out from the original starting point in Queen Anne Street? Assuredly, having lost his first arrow, he must shoot a second after it. The queer idea, then, that had visited the heated mind of Hammond was so to prime circumstance that, dropping in upon its tide at the psychological second, he should pass once more through those strange and bewildering things that he but half remembered. With a feeling of high elation, he purchased a pound's weight of small red beads, confided in detail and for the first time in a friend, and got himself invited to Sir Windrop's, securing a Friday as the date. Three. Through some confusion of expression and a good deal more of thought, one can still see pretty plainly in Hammond's diary what his intention was in going again to Sir Windrop's. A black taxi with flying crepe, he thinks. Peculiar. I had better dine at the same house at the same time and stroll out into the same street. The taxi will be there. He tries, as his diary shows, to find some analogy to the kind of operation he contemplates. Riotous phrases are scribbled about. He is playing pranks with experience, setting life's alarum, or probing a metaphysical false bottom. Altogether, it is evident that he found considerable difficulty in explaining to himself in any set terms the exact nature of his experiment. That experiment, we have it from Sir Windrop himself, he conducted with calm and deliberation. Winton, he said, do you remember what you were telling me the last time I was over here? Rather an interesting case, I thought it. I seem to have forgotten a good deal about it, though. Tell it me again. Sir Winthrop, a heavy man with a mind of elephantine gait, considered ponderously as he poured out a glass of port and viewed it with one eye screwed.
"Yes,"
he said.
"Yes, I remember it. It was like this."
He must picture him conversing, the measured cadence of his periods broken only by sippings at his glass, and the sharp, nervous voice of Hammond. The guest thought, "This is silly. I can't cheat experience like this. My idea is that with all the points set the same way, the engine will always travel along the same lines. But I can't get all the points set the same way. There are hundreds of them, thousands, millions, yet perhaps some only are essential. My particular emotional tone, I expect. Now, last time I was here, I was thinking about when I was a little boy, and a long black hearse when Nurse died. I must make a note of that." Sir Winthrop Winton leant over and tapped on his guest's shirt front.
"I tell you,"
said he,
"it is so. You may agree with me, or of course you may not, but it was most undoubtedly a case of that precise description. I should swear it on my deathbed."
"Yes," said Hammond dreamily. "Such a nice deathbed. Brown blanket with funny figures on it, like little men marching. They covered her over, of course, with a white sheet when she was perfectly dead." Under the weighty disapproval of Sir Winthrop, and no longer thinking of laying traps for circumstance, he walked out into the night and strode quickly down the pavement. Cold wind was blowing, and it caught Hammond's neck wrap so that the ends flapped, streaming past his ears. Thus he progressed like some symbolic figure of strain and effort, butting at the wind doggedly with his silk hat. Again an ineffable sense of high elation caught his spirit, and under the windy, starlit heavens, his mind seemed to flash back into that mysterious, breathless state of wonder and airy trance. Only once or twice before had he struck it, a state that lay full of childhood memories and pulsed all aglow with the vibrant joy of one who lights suddenly and unexpectedly upon something long lost, long forgotten. Thus, let us say, he passed along towards the bottom of Cavendish Square and reached the spot where before he had found the taxi. A sudden dismay came upon him as he noticed that nothing was to be seen of the strange vehicle or its driver. Had he omitted too much? Were the circumstances too dissimilar for history to repeat itself? No, that was his old wrong idea, ridiculously naive and crude, born only of a moment's madness. The idea of trapping experience as one might trap a hare or a mole. It was the mental state that set the cue, that counted, and that alone. Other conditions were adventitious and unessential. Yet, no taxi. As quickly as it had arrived, his dismay was ended. Behind him, creeping swiftly, with a curious absence of noise, came nosing a long black taxi, with a tall figure at the steering wheel. He wondered whether the driver wore the same wrinkled mackintosh, and whether those were flapping scarves that he could make out, streaming from the windows like dusky puggaries. For a moment he hesitated, wavering, with one hand stretched towards the door. Then the taxi seemed to open to him spontaneously, and he found himself sunk inside upon the cushions. Quickly, the door slammed to. The driver threw in the clutch, and the queer blinds fell, plunging him into darkness. Again, they were off. 4. Very early on the following morning, when the dawn was flushing the eastern sky over Hackney Wick, a long, lean man in gaiters ran out of his house and took a tube to Queen Anne Street. He was the friend to whom Hammond's experience had been confided. He set out at a brisk pace along Oxford Street by way of Prince's Street and then turned into Charing Cross Road, with his eyes glued to the ground. Presently he stopped with a half-suppressed cry and picked something up. It was a tiny bead of ruby-coloured glass. Further on he found more of them, and for an hour he followed the trail, panting, dodging trams and drays, execrated by carmen and eyed suspiciously by constables. By 11 o'clock he was well into southern London, and entered a small restaurant, where he had some sausage rolls and a quarter of an hour's rest. He started off again hot-foot, for the beads were plentiful, and reached Lee Green by way of Lewisham shortly after noon. A little later the beads diverged sharply to the east along a common, and then stopped. It was a cheerless spot. To the north lay the river, and opposite it the road to Woolwich wound along the top of sad clay cliffs. There the gaudy brick of houses newly built flared in the surrounding grey, and behind them the motor buses of line 66Z flickered a consequential scarlet. The man who had followed the trail reviewed the position sorrowfully. To him it was patent that his friend had been caught terribly away from life, from riding on suburban train tops to the Institute, from reading Bosanquet and Stout and Bradley, from producing careful, decorative speeches at the British Academy, from everything, in fact, that mattered. He pictured Mr. Hammond fallen horribly out of all this amiable futility, down some pernicious kind of drain or trap-door, which circumstance, by an awful oversight, had left unclosed. Near him, on the ground, were discernible the ruinous foundations of ancient dwellings. His brain swelled and beat in the excitement of a theory. They must be the vestiges of former buildings which had flanked the marsh, and it was possible that amongst them had stood the house of Mr. Hammond's story. The unfortunate philosopher had fallen through some deplorable chink in his own century into the one behind it. The man in gaiters became so excited that he gesticulated to himself. Presently the bizarre possibility glowed to certainty within him, and rapidly he sketched out headings for a paper on the case. In the following spring, when it was abundantly evident that Hammond had disappeared, never to return, it was this very paper that raised its author to the pinnacle of fame, as the propounder of a new theory of time and space. After a while he wearied of these anticipated glories, and noticed that the sun was slanting yellower towards the west. With a last glance at the crumbling ruins and the sad sweep of the distant river, he boarded a crimson motor bus, and so returned to tea and Hackney Wick. Today's story was The Grey House by John Metcalfe. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, sweet dreams.